Welcome, my friends. Settle in and settle down. Tonight we will be talking about the night Zeus slept, a story of a god no longer needed. I want you to lay back, relax, and listen. Let's take a moment to go to the comments and tell me where you're from and what time it is for you. I love to see the diversity, and it helps keep me motivated to know the deep crevices of where my stories reach. As always, if you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Your support goes a very long way. Night had deepened across Olympus, and the wind had quieted to a whisper no louder than breath against stone. The great halls that once echoed with laughter and debate now rested in silence, cloaked in soft shadow and laced with drifting strands of cloud that curled along the marble floors like lazy ghosts. Stars shimmered beyond the high mist, barely visible through the ever-shifting canopy above, their light cold and unhurried, casting no judgment. Olympus was still, sleeping in the way only eternal places can, without threat, without urgency, without need. And yet, in the highest chamber beneath the dome of the sky, Zeus did not sleep. He lay awake, his eyes open but unfocused, fixed on nothing in particular. The chamber was dark but for the dim gleam of a single bronze lamp that burned low on a pedestal, its flame swaying gently in the draftless air. His bed, carved of cloudstone and veined with flickers of light like frozen lightning, remained untouched. The sheets were smooth, unwrinkled. Hera had not joined him. She had taken to other chambers of late, not out of anger, but out of rhythm. The way old rivers once joined, sometimes split to follow parallel paths. Neither questioned it. In Olympus, closeness did not always require nearness. After a time, he rose, not abruptly. His bare feet touched the stone without sound. The cloak that rested at the foot of the bed rose with a flick of his fingers, folding itself across his shoulders like fog drawn from the sky. He stepped into the corridor beyond, not with purpose, but with pull. Something quieter than thought, urging him forward. The halls of Olympus welcomed him, as they always had. Columns loomed high into shadow, half lit by moonlight, filtered through translucent panels of clouded crystal, each one engraved with scenes from lives long forgotten. No fire burned in the braziers tonight. There was no warmth to summon, no gathering to mark. Only silence, not empty, but rich with memory. His footsteps did not echo, not because the stone refused them, but because it had heard them so many times before. Familiarity dulled the sound. He passed beneath the vault of the eastern rotunda, where the constellations of the gods shimmered faintly above in rotating glass. A thin mist curled at the base of the walls, luminous and still, as if Olympus itself were breathing in sleep. He did not look upward yet. That would come later. For now, his eyes remained on the corridor ahead, on the path that curved slowly toward the northern balcony. The high point where the air grew thin, where the mortal world could be seen when the clouds consented to part. There was no hurry. Zeus moved with the unspoken understanding that time belonged to him. He did not race against it. He did not need to measure it. He simply moved through it, as one might drift through a river they themselves had shaped. Tonight, though, something felt different. Not wrong, and not urgent, but unfamiliar, as though the world had shifted a fraction of an inch in its cradle, and the weight of that tilt, though imperceptible to mortals, was enough to rouse a god from rest. He had felt it before, once, perhaps, when Atlantis had whispered its last breath into the sea, or when the final embers of a forgotten empire blinked out beneath desert stars, a subtle stirring in the long rhythm of the earth, a breath held longer than usual, a question unspoken, but hanging in the dark. And so he walked, past the great feasting hall, now empty, past the columns where vines once bloomed in eternal spring, past the doors of chambers that had not opened in many years. He did not disturb them. Some gods slept, and sleep, when earned, should not be broken. He reached the final stair and ascended. At the top, the wind met him, cool and steady, touched with the scent of snow from some distant peak, and the ghost of lightning not yet formed. The clouds parted before him, as they always did, revealing the soft shimmer of the world below. Hills like folded cloth, rivers winding like silk threads, cities asleep in the crook of valleys, their lights flickering faintly in the dark. From here, the world looked delicate, barely real, a place of smoke and breath, a flickering warmth cupped in the hands of time. Zeus stood at the edge and watched. He said nothing. He only breathed. And the sky, it seemed, breathed with him. He stood a while at the edge, watching the slow shimmer of the world below. But the view did not hold him tonight. It was beautiful, yes. It always had been. But beauty alone was not what called to him now. There was something else, quieter and more elusive, threading itself through the chambers of Olympus, moving just beyond the reach of thought. He turned from the sky and made his way back through the high corridor, his fingers grazing the smooth walls as he walked, trailing along grooves and carvings worn by time and reverence both. The air inside was cooler now, the kind of stillness that settles in old temples long after the incense has faded. Cloud light filtered down from vaulted skylights overhead, casting everything in shifting silver. Where torches had once burned bright in celebration, now only pale echoes of light rippled across the columns. These halls had been built in the early days, not with mortal hands, but with intent, with vision, with the careful pressure of will upon stone. They rose into the mist and into memory, shaped to endure, not to impress. The floors beneath him held the weight of history, but not just his. Every god who had walked these halls had left a trace, not in dust or footprints, but in presence. The corridors felt full even when they were silent, as though echoes moved just a second behind every step. He moved slowly, not out of age, but out of respect for the stillness. To his left stood the frieze of the forging, a long, sweeping wall carved in low relief, its surface marked with flowing depictions of the world's earliest moments. Titans rising and falling, the sea drawn back to reveal land, stars gathered into constellations, each one lit from behind with a faint, steady glow. He had passed this frieze thousands of times, and yet he always paused here, not to study the carvings, but to feel what they stirred. It was not nostalgia, exactly. The past did not recede for him the way it did for mortals, but it folded, coiled upon itself like smoke, and sometimes it rose in unexpected moments, full of warmth or ache or both. He moved on, descending a shallow set of stairs that opened into the eastward gallery. This was where the ceilings lifted even higher, giving way to wide arches that looked out over valleys of drifting cloud. Great pillars lined the edges of the open walls, each wrapped in ivy that never browned, never bloomed, a living memory of seasons long abandoned. At the far end of the gallery, the hearth still stood. A simple structure, round and low, built of old stone and ringed in bronze. No fire burned there now, but the stone held warmth nonetheless. as though the memory of flame were enough to keep it alive. This had been Hestia's place once, before she withdrew, before her quiet became deeper than even Olympus could hold. The hearth was hers, but it belonged to all of them too, a center, a point of return. In the early days, they had gathered there not as rulers, but as siblings, as new beings unsure of their own boundaries. The time had passed, but the memory clung, not in sorrow, but in shape. He stepped closer and sat on the low stone ledge, resting his hand lightly against the bronze. It was warm, yes, but not with fire. It felt like the pulse of something sleeping beneath. Not alive in the way mortals would describe it, but full of presence, of rhythm, of some ancient pattern too vast to name. He remained there for a while, saying nothing, thinking little, letting the air move around him and through him. When he finally stood, he did so slowly, as though lifting himself, not just from the stone, but from a moment that had settled too deeply. He passed once more through the gallery, into the connecting hall that curved back toward the center of Olympus, where the great chambers branched like roots into different wings. He passed doors, all closed, the chamber of Athena, silent and unreadable, the entrance to the forge, long dormant but not abandoned, the archway draped in gauze-thin veils, where Aphrodite once stood beneath moonlight, brushing her hair as if the stars were watching. He did not pause at these thresholds tonight. He only noted them, the way one notes familiar trees along a path they have walked many times. He continued on until the corridor narrowed again, guiding him upward once more, toward a place he rarely visited, the Hall of Echoes. It was not a room of council or worship, not a throne room or archive. It had no ceremonial purpose. It had simply emerged, in time, as Olympus grew. A space where sound lingered longer than it should, where music once played did not quite end, and where laughter, if it had ever passed through, still clung faintly to the air. He stepped into it, and immediately the texture of the silence changed. It was not absence. It was depth, as though sound had soaked into the walls and never quite let go. He walked slowly, his gaze drifting toward the shadows cast by unseen stars. This place, more than any other, reminded him that even gods are shaped by memory, not just of war or worship, but of presence, of moments shared, of things that made the long ages feel like more than time. The Hall of Echoes welcomed him, not loudly, not with sound, but with a sense of return. And Zeus, though he had not planned to come here tonight, understood now why he had not been able to sleep. The Hall of Echoes held no torches, no glowing braziers or gilded sconces. Light in this place came from the marble itself, as if the stone remembered illumination and softly repeated it. The glow was diffuse, like the reflection of a long-set sun, enough to see but never to dazzle. It was a place meant for quiet, and yet it remembered sound. That was its nature, to hold what had passed through it, not in voice, but in atmosphere. Here joy did not fade. It lingered. Zeus walked slowly, his steps inaudible, though he did not tread lightly. There was no need. This place welcomed wait. It had been built in the early days as a place of gathering, though none could quite remember when it became what it was now. Perhaps it had always been like this, a space where the laughter of gods lingered, not as sound, but as warmth pressed faintly into the stone. He passed a long table, now bare, once laid with endless platters of fruits and roasted meats, where goblets had clinked together and wine had spilled freely onto linens embroidered by divine hands. The table's surface bore no dust, no decay. Olympus did not allow for such things. But the absence of use was a feeling unto itself. Not loss, precisely. More like the sense that joy had simply gone elsewhere, without explanation. He paused near the archway where Apollo had once stood with his lyre, strings gleaming with starlight, fingers moving not with showmanship, but ease. The music had never needed to be loud. It had filled the space like rising mist, curling through every corner and into every breath. The muses would sing there, each voice distinct and flawless, overlapping like waves that never crashed. On some nights, even Artemis would remain longer than usual, standing just within the shadows, listening with that peculiar stillness of hers that meant she was fully present. Hermes, of course, would dance, not always in rhythm, but always with spirit, slipping between guests, stealing sips from cups he'd already emptied, flicking olive pits toward the ceiling where they stuck like stars before falling. Dionysus would laugh until the stone itself seemed to vibrate, his joy infectious, boundless, laced with something ancient and untamed. The kind of joy that threatened to tip over into chaos, if not gently caught by steadier hands. Zeus did not often laugh aloud in those days, but when he had, it was in this hall, not from amusement, but from recognition, that beneath all their power, their dominion and legend, the gods were kin, and kin, when at ease, create a kind of music no instrument can replicate. He continued through the chamber, past the basin where nectar once flowed, its scent now only a trace in the air. The basin still shimmered faintly, though nothing ran through it now. It reflected no face, but it caught the movement of memory as surely as water once caught light. Beside it stood a simple bench, curved like the crescent of a moon, where Hera had once sat with her head tilted in rare laughter. Her eyes half-lidded in that quiet way, she looked at things that pleased her more than she would admit. He had sat beside her there once, not as king and queen, but simply as two presences at peace. The memory was not sharp, not painful. It had no edges. It simply existed, folded gently into the room. The far end of the hall opened to a colonnade where the ceiling rose even higher, and the clouds passed more freely between the pillars. Here, the laughter had faded first, though the light remained. The last great gathering had been held in this space, years ago now, by mortal reckoning. The gods had feasted, danced, told stories. But even then, the tone had shifted. Less celebration, more remembering. A farewell without saying so. No event followed it. No cataclysm. Just the quiet dispersal of presence. Like leaves falling not from wind, but because their time had come. Zeus paused beneath one of the great columns, placing his hand against the stone. It was smooth, cool, and still carried a faint vibration. Not sound, but presence. As though the column itself remembered holding the roof above 1,000 songs. He closed his eyes, just briefly, and listened, not for words, but for rhythm. It was there, faint and slow. Not laughter now, but breath. Olympus, too, breathed, even in silence. When he opened his eyes, the hall seemed larger, not emptier, only quieter. The kind of quiet that holds meaning rather than absence. He did not linger much longer. There was nothing to retrieve, nothing to stir back to life. But there was a path to follow. The stillness had led him here, and it now pulled him onward, not toward throne or temple, but toward the high place beyond the eastern stairs. A narrow walk that curved along the outer spine of Olympus itself, where the sky grew thinner and the world below seemed closer, clearer, almost touchable. And so he walked, not in mourning, not in longing, but in memory, steady and whole, as the halls behind him held their peace. The path along Olympus's spine was narrow but sure, a ribbon of stone carved long ago by divine hands that had shaped it not for travel, but for perspective. Here, no columns rose to frame the view, no walls enclosed the wind. There was only the open sky and the slow, endless expanse of the world beneath, vast, sleeping, eternal in its turning. Zeus moved carefully, not because he feared the height, but because this place demanded attention. Even gods, when close to the edge of creation, moved with reverence. He came to the overlook, a simple half-moon of polished marble that jutted outward like the prow of a ship suspended above the clouds. He stood there without speaking, letting the wind move through his cloak, brushing past him as if he were a statue, not a god. The sky stretched out in all directions, deep and dark, pierced by stars that shimmered without urgency. Below, the mortal world lay curled in sleep. Forests layered like shadows upon shadows, rivers silvered in moonlight, villages lit with tiny fires that flickered like echoes of Olympus itself. It was beautiful in the way all things distant are, unknowable, untouched, safe. But Zeus did not watch as a stranger. He had shaped that world. Not every grove or tower, not every mountain or harbor, but its rhythm, its structure, its pulse. The seasons bent to his will, or had once. The storms listened to his breath. Thunder had been his voice, and lightning his gesture. And for a long time, that world had looked up and known him, feared him, prayed to him, cursed him. They had carved his likeness in temples, painted his name on scrolls, whispered his power into the wind. But the wind did not carry his name as far anymore, and he did not blame it. He watched the cities now, so many of them brighter than he remembered, not with fire, but with something colder, steadier. Lights that did not flicker, even in wind or rain. They pulsed like veins across the land, shaping roads and clusters and towers. Mortals had grown clever. They shaped metal into machines, thought into sound, distance into nothing. They reached toward the stars, not with prayer, but with wires and flame. They no longer begged for rain. They mapped it. They no longer asked the skies for omens. They studied them. And yet, in some ways, they were the same. He had seen it before, in other forms. The desire to understand, the hunger to shape. Mortals were always reaching, always gathering pieces of the world into patterns they could hold. And sometimes, in their sleep, they still whispered the old names, not in fear, not in ritual, but in stories, in dreams. It was enough. He sat at the edge of the overlook, his legs drawn up loosely, cloak pooled around him like fallen cloud. He looked not at the grand cities now, but at the smaller places, the scattered lights of a village nestled beside a lake, a shepherd walking beneath the moon with a staff in hand, and no companion but a dog, a boat drifting slow across a darkened bay, its lantern swaying gently with the tide. In those quiet places, he could still feel the breath of the world, not loud, not grand, but steady, honest. Mortal lives were short, yes, but they burned with a kind of immediacy that even gods could not always match. They loved without certainty. They built despite knowing ruin. They sang even when no one was listening. A low breeze swept across the overlook, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant salt, and something else. The faint, sharp edge of a coming storm. Zeus tilted his head. The clouds on the horizon were gathering, slowly, naturally, not at his command, not in response to mood or omen, It was simply time. Weather, once his signature, now moved of its own accord more often than not. And still, he did not interfere. He had not stepped away. Not fully, but he had loosened his grip. There was wisdom in that, in allowing the world to breathe on its own. He had shaped it, yes, but he had never truly owned it. Olympus had never been a throne above all things. It had been a watchtower, a hearth, a high place from which to learn. And tonight, as he looked down at the sleeping world and the sky slowly churning above it, he felt no urge to intervene, only to witness. He remained there for some time, unmoving, as the stars wheeled slowly overhead and the storm approached with the patience of old things. The wind rose, cooled, curled beneath his cloak like an old friend returning from far places. He did not speak to it. He only breathed. And below, the world turned on. The corridor that led inward from the overlook was older than the rest of Olympus. Its walls were shaped not from gleaming marble, but from dense, weathered stone that bore the imprint of time more than intention. There were no tapestries or braziers, no divine ornaments to remind the traveler of glory. Just stone and quiet, and a coolness that settled gently against the skin. It was a path meant for withdrawal, not escape, but retreat. The kind that comes after long thought, when noise offers nothing more and presence becomes its own kind of burden. Zeus walked slowly, not from weariness, but from awareness. This part of Olympus had not been carved to impress others. It had been built to endure. He passed alcoves and empty doorways, chambers he had entered only rarely. Some held artifacts, fragments of old gatherings, abandoned tools, unread scrolls, not discarded, only left behind. They remained undisturbed, preserved not by effort, but by a kind of mutual understanding. Here, even time moved more carefully. The deeper he went, the fewer turns the path took, until finally it opened into a round chamber, smooth-walled and open to the sky. The ceiling had never been placed. Instead, a wide circle of open air gave view directly to the stars. It was neither grand nor small, but precisely what it needed to be. A place of deliberate quiet. The wind did not whistle here. It moved through gently, touched the stone, and continued on. The chamber was shaped like a bowl, not for containment, but for rest. At the center of the room was a stone platform, long and flat, with no cushioning, no cloth, no softness of any kind. It wasn't a throne or altar. It was a bed. One shaped for a body to lie down, not to be seen. It had no carvings or symbols, just a surface smoothed by age and use. It had been part of Olympus for as long as he could remember, perhaps even before. No one else used it. No one else needed to. Zeus approached and sat down, placing both hands flat against the surface beside him. The stone was cool, not unpleasantly so, and carried the weight of stillness better than anything else on the mountain. He didn't look up at the stars right away. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening. Not for sound, but for what remained underneath it, the quiet rhythm of Olympus at night, the kind that didn't call attention to itself. There was no divine message in it, just steadiness. He lay back slowly, his cloak settling around him as he adjusted his shoulders against the hard surface. It did not conform to him. It did not cradle. But it held, and that was enough. For all his life, for all his power, there were few things that had held him without needing anything in return. This stone, this room, the night air. None of it required command. None of it asked questions. He stared up at the sky, at the familiar constellations that had once carried the names of heroes in stories long passed into mortal hands. They spun slowly overhead, patient in their cycles. He watched them not as omens or signs, but as patterns. Old ones that had kept moving whether he paid attention or not. The stars were not loyal to Olympus. They simply were. And for once, that thought was comforting. It was difficult to name the feeling that settled over him then. It wasn't peace, exactly, and not sleep. But it was close to both. A stillness that didn't resist thought, but softened it. He thought of Hera, not in conflict or ceremony, but in quiet companionship. He thought of the others, of Poseidon's loud entrances, of Hestia's careful silence, of Hermes speaking far too quickly about things no one asked. He thought of the mountain itself, how it had grown quieter not from absence, but from shift. Olympus had not died. It had simply changed shape. Zeus let his eyes close, not to force sleep, but to stop reaching. It was not a surrender, just a moment of being where he was, with no need to judge the weight of it. He didn't know if he would sleep, but he knew he didn't have to stay awake. Above him, the stars continued their slow, unbroken movement. And for now, Olympus held. The sky above shifted slowly, stars drifting across the vast frame of the open chamber like embers carried by a patient wind. The shape of the night changed without effort, without sound. There were no birds here, no distant murmur of forests or cities. Olympus sat above all that, not in arrogance, but in remove, a space apart. Within that silence, there was a rhythm that could only be heard when all other rhythms had faded. Not a heartbeat, not quite breath, but something constant. It did not belong to Zeus alone. It belonged to the mountain. And through the mountain, it touched him. He did not sleep, but neither did he stir. The stone beneath him had grown warmer from his presence, though it remained firm and unmoving. His limbs were relaxed, but his thoughts moved with a slow clarity, not in pursuit of anything, only observation. He became aware of his body in a way he seldom did. The shape of his shoulders, the angle of his spine against the slab, the way the fabric of his cloak shifted slightly with each breath. The sensation was not discomfort. It was presence. Time here was hard to measure. There were no bells to chime the hour, no torches burning low. The stars told their own time, but not in numbers. They simply moved. Perhaps an hour passed, perhaps more. Zeus did not count. He only noticed the slight change in the breeze, the way the air cooled just a little further, carrying with it the high scent of fresh stone and distant weather. He turned his head slightly on the stone. The open sky remained in view, now darker in places where cloud began to gather. Thin veils at first, harmless and high. But he knew what they meant. Weather was forming, not at his hand, but of its own accord, the slow, natural build of a night storm forming somewhere far below. He could sense the pressure shifting, the balance of moisture and heat. These things had once moved only at his command. Now they arrived without needing it, and he let them. He listened for thunder, but none came. Only the subtle thrum of gathering clouds beyond the horizon. A living thing, but not loud. There was something satisfying in that. The world no longer waited for his gesture to change its course. He had shaped it long ago, shaped the rules, the forces. And now those forces moved without prompting. Not rebellion, not disrespect. Continuation. That was how it should be. The stillness around him began to deepen. It was not a new silence, but a fuller one, like sound being gently carried away instead of stopped. Even thoughts seemed quieter now, not gone, but softened. He remembered stories told of gods who feared quiet, who kept their halls full of music and laughter and company for fear of what silence might bring. He had known those fears once, not of being alone, but of losing the weight of his presence, of becoming forgotten. But that feeling had faded, gradually, without announcement. It wasn't peace he felt now, not in the way mortals might describe it, but something steadier. Not being held, but no longer holding. Letting the weight rest. For so long, even when he had stepped back from the affairs of the world, he had kept watch. Not with tension, but with expectation that he might be needed again, that the world would falter without him. Now he wasn't so sure, and the thought didn't trouble him. He closed his eyes again, not from tiredness, but to let his other senses rise. He could feel the faintest tremble of air shift through the chamber, the echo of his own breath against the curve of stone. He felt no danger, no demand. Just existence, stripped of ceremony, the kind that few gods ever reached, because they were too bound to being seen, to being known. There were no prayers tonight. None reached Olympus, none passed through its halls. And still, it stood. Still he breathed. Still the world moved. He didn't know what came next. Not in the grand sense, not in prophecy or fate, but in the simple mortal way of not knowing where the next hour would lead. It felt honest, uncomplicated, the kind of unknowing that did not beg for answers, only for stillness. Above him, the clouds passed across the stars, dimming their glow. But he did not need them to see. The stone was still beneath him, the air cool above, and his body quiet within its place. He remained there, unmoving, as the night thickened gently around him. The first roll of thunder reached Olympus, like a whisper lost in a cavern. It did not shake the stone or echo across the peaks. It simply arrived, distant and low, as if the sky were stretching in its sleep. Zeus opened his eyes, not startled but attentive, and kept his gaze on the rim of the open ceiling above. The clouds had grown denser, their shapes now deeper and more deliberate, trailing edges like slow-moving currents in dark water. He remained lying down, arms relaxed at his sides, his breathing unchanged. The mountain beneath him gave no sign of concern. It had withstood far greater storms, many of which he himself had once summoned. But this one was not his. That made it interesting. The clouds gathered over a distant valley far below, likely near the Aegean. He could sense it in the pressure, the moisture, the movement of air across the sea. The kind of summer storm that built itself over the course of an evening, born from heat and humidity and the quiet friction of converging winds. It was not a divine warning, not a message from the sky. It was weather, natural, self-sufficient, almost indifferent. That was what made it beautiful. Another rumble followed, a little closer this time, but still too far to reach Olympus with any weight. The mountain remained dry. The wind moved a little faster, its edges crisper, but it carried no urgency. Zeus turned his head slightly, watching a single thread of lightning flicker behind a veil of cloud. It lit the sky for less than a second, a pale blue vein across a charcoal canvas. There had been a time when every bolt answered to him. Now they did not ask for permission. He felt no bitterness in that, no loss. Control was not the same as connection. Letting go of one didn't mean severing the other. The world had grown into itself. In his long stillness, it had learned to move on its own. He had not stopped being its origin, but he no longer needed to shape its every step. He let his eyes linger on the clouds. The wind shifted again, drawing cooler air across his skin. He could smell the edge of rain, even from here, sharp, metallic, and full of life. That scent always came just before the first drop. He had never found a way to describe it in language. No word had ever captured it fully. But he had always known it, deep and instinctively, like a memory that didn't need explanation. He sat up slowly, keeping one hand on the stone bed as a counterbalance, and looked toward the open archway where the corridor led back into the rest of Olympus. No one stirred. No voices called. The halls were still and undisturbed, holding the kind of silence that came not from emptiness, but from rest. The kind of quiet that didn't ask to be filled. He remained seated for a while, watching the storm shift in the distance. A second bolt followed the first, brighter this time, illuminating the curve of the horizon. Then came the low, rolling response, thunder, slower and fuller now, with weight behind it. Still too far to threaten, but close enough to carry depth. He thought briefly of the mortals below. Some would be watching the sky, anticipating the rain. Others would already be inside, shuttering windows or lighting lamps. A few might feel fear, though not many. This kind of storm was familiar, routine, the kind that nourished crops and filled rivers, even if it woke a few from sleep. It was the kind of weather that reminded people they were part of something larger, something that didn't pause for their plans. That reminder, he thought, had always been one of nature's quiet mercies. He stood, rolling his shoulders gently to settle the weight of his cloak. His body had grown stiff from lying still, but not sore. He took one final look at the sky overhead, the stars now mostly hidden, the storm stretching across half the horizon, then turned toward the corridor once more. There was no destination in mind, no reason to act. He walked slowly, not to seek anything, but simply to move through the stillness that remained. The thunder rolled again, softer now. The storm was shifting course, and Olympus, high above it all, stood unchanged. The halls of Olympus had not changed in structure, but something about their presence felt different at night. Without the usual echo of voices or the flare of divine energy, the corridors seemed to stretch longer, quieter, more rooted in the stone than in the glory they once represented. As Zeus walked, his footfalls made no sound. Not because he was silent, but because Olympus knew how to carry its own stillness. The marble did not greet him with grandeur. It simply welcomed his passage like it had for centuries. Steadily, without ceremony. Pillars lined the corridor at regular intervals, tall and smooth, their surfaces slightly dulled by time. Torches had long since gone unused, for Olympus no longer needed flame to illuminate its halls. Faint threads of golden light flowed along the grooves in the stone. Not magic, not power. Just a quiet echo of what had once filled this place. He passed under archways etched with scenes of old triumphs, battles long concluded, alliances forged in moments of necessity. Once, those carvings had been reminders. Now, they were memories. Persistent, but no longer loud. He walked with no particular aim. The mountain was familiar to him in every detail. He knew where each hallway bent, where each chamber stood behind its doors. But in the absence of demand, movement itself became something else. A gesture of thought, not purpose. His eyes took in each passage, not with appraisal, but with recognition. These were the paths of his home, not his domain. He paused beside an open gallery overlooking the mountain's lower slopes. From here, the world below stretched outward in soft darkness. Villages clustered near rivers, their lights like scattered seeds across the land. Fields rested in their summer growth. Forests stood in quiet silhouettes, and the storm, now further away, flashed only faintly at the edge of the horizon. The world looked small from here, but never insignificant. That had always been a mistake the younger gods made, equating scale with meaning. He had learned better. The air carried the scent of old stone and distant rain. It passed through the columns gently, brushing against his face with the same softness he remembered from younger days. Even then, when Olympus had been filled with argument and fire, he had found peace in the night air. Not because it offered answers, but because it asked nothing of him. He leaned one hand against a nearby pillar, its surface cool and firm beneath his palm. There had been voices in these halls once, many of them all at once. Loud ones, proud ones. Athena pacing with her mind, 3 steps ahead of her speech. Ares making grand declarations with more passion than thought. Dionysus half laughing, half arguing some point no one had asked him to make. They had filled the air with presence, and he, always at the center, had carried their weight, whether they noticed or not. Now the silence was complete. Not hollow, not lonely, just whole. Olympus was no longer a place of constant gathering. The halls remained, but they held their quiet like a sacred bond. Not an end, but a shift. A new form of service. Even stillness could be a function. It could be something to return to, something that existed not for the gods, but for what the gods had left behind. He resumed walking, slower now, letting his fingers brush lightly along the walls as he passed. The stone was marked in places, bearing subtle signs of where others had leaned, sat, or rested over the ages. None of it had been polished away. The mountain did not erase what had touched it. Ahead, the path narrowed into an older wing of the palace, a place few visited, even when Olympus was full. It had been built not for hosting or ruling, but for thought. The floors here were darker, the light dimmer. Not because of age or decay, but by design. A place for reflection rather than proclamation. Zeus stepped through its threshold, the air cooling further around him. He was not here to seek wisdom or guidance. He simply wanted to be somewhere the world had forgotten to speak. Somewhere the past did not weigh, but simply existed. The quiet deepened, and he let it. The deeper halls of Olympus were older than most remembered. Their stones had not been touched by light in centuries, and yet they remained solid, unmoved by time or disuse. These were not the thrones and war rooms carved for glory. They were the bones of the mountain, buried beneath splendor, built in a time when Olympus was still forming, when gods first decided to build something permanent in a world that rarely allowed it. Zeus moved slowly through the narrow corridor, the ceiling dipping lower with each step. Here the air was cooler, touched with the scent of mineral and deep earth. No stars reached this far. No wind stirred. But even in the stillness, the space felt awake, not watching, but aware. He did not light a flame. He didn't need to. The passage remembered his presence, the way a forest remembers where its oldest roots lie. There was a soft glow in the stone itself, barely visible, more suggestion than illumination. It traced the arch of the ceiling and shimmered faintly where his footsteps touched the ground. This had once been a place of solitude, even in Olympus's prime, a retreat for thought, for quiet, for gods who needed stillness before returning to their roles. Few had come here often. Fewer still had stayed long. Zeus had not returned in many years. He had almost forgotten the slope of the walls, the curve of the floor, the soft echo that followed each movement like a question not quite asked. He entered a small chamber at the end of the hall. No door marked its entrance. It was round, domed, and carved directly into the rock. There were no carvings, no symbols of power, no echoes of worship. Only smooth stone, shaped with patience, and a single slab at its center, not an altar, not a throne, just a surface wide enough to sit or lie or think. He moved toward it without hesitation, lowering himself onto the edge. The air was perfectly still. Even his breath sounded distant here, like it belonged to someone else. He looked around slowly, not searching for anything, but letting the space remind him of itself. There were memories here, not of events, but of presence. He had come here once, when the world had nearly torn itself in two. Another time when he had been tempted to disappear, not as punishment, not as retreat, simply to be absent. And yet, he had never truly left. Not then, not now. Olympus still held him, not because it needed to, but because it remembered. He leaned back against the cool surface, letting his shoulders settle into the curve of the stone. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, though there was little to see. The room was nearly featureless, and that was its strength. It was a place where no mask could be worn, where even gods had nothing to perform. The silence did not judge. It simply endured. As he sat there, the memory of voices drifted faintly through him, not words, not sounds, just impressions. A low hum of past thought, a presence left behind by those who had once sat here and asked nothing of the world for a time. He did not speak. There was no need to fill the space. Not all silence was empty. Some of it was shaped, crafted, held. He let his head tilt back, resting lightly against the stone. His breathing slowed again, not out of tiredness, but from settling. He was not above the world now, not commanding from on high. He was beneath Olympus, within it, rooted as much as the mountain itself. And for the first time in a long while, he felt no impulse to rise. Time moved differently in the deeper places of Olympus. There were no sunbeams or shifting stars to mark its passing, no bells to chime it forward, just the slow, quiet rhythm of being. Zeus had not fallen asleep, but his thoughts had wandered into something near it. Not dreaming, not drifting, just still. A state beyond decision, where nothing needed tending and nothing pulled. Eventually, he rose, not quickly, not with purpose. His body moved as the mountain did, gradually, without hurry. The air felt cooler against his skin now, the walls less like stone and more like breath. He stood in the quiet for a moment longer, then stepped back into the narrow corridor. The glow along the path still lingered, dim but certain. It guided him not like a path laid before a king, but like the memory of footsteps still fresh in the stone. His return to the upper halls was slow, not from fatigue, but because the silence was something worth carrying. Every step away from the chamber felt like a soft pulse upward, like waking from a long thought. The corridors opened wider. The ceilings grew taller again. And soon, he was back beneath the open sky. The stars had returned, the clouds had passed in the hours he'd been below, and the heavens had cleared with the quiet resolve of the sea after storm. A few pinpricks of light still danced at the edge of the world, where the storm had gone to rest elsewhere. But above Olympus, all was calm. Zeus paused just inside the gallery, the same one he had visited before, when the thunder was still distant. Now, only the wind moved, light, steady, brushing along the edges of the stone like a forgotten song. He stepped toward the outer edge and leaned against the column again, his hand finding the same cool groove in the stone as before. The world below looked unchanged, but he felt the subtle difference. Lamps had dimmed in some of the distant homes. A few had gone out entirely. Most of the villages were sleeping now. The land breathed slower. Even from this distance, he could feel it. There had been no revelations in the halls beneath the mountain. No visions, no divine messages. Only stillness. But that had always been enough. Not every night had to offer change. Some were meant only for returning to oneself, to silence, to the shape of the world as it was when no one asked anything of it. He looked up at the stars again. They had never stopped burning. Even when clouds covered them, they remained. That was something mortals often forgot. That hidden did not mean absent. That silence was not always lack. The sky did not speak every night, and yet it endured. The wind shifted slightly. It carried with it the faintest warmth from the valleys below. It smelled of turned soil, river stone, and distant pines. It was the kind of scent that did not belong to gods or kings, but to life itself, to breath and root and pulse. Zeus stepped back from the gallery and turned toward the heart of Olympus. The halls were still empty. No movement stirred in the chambers beyond. But that too felt right. This was not a night for gatherings. It was a night for quiet, for presence. He returned to the place he had begun. The open stone platform beneath the stars, the cool slab where his body had once rested in unrest. He lay back down, slowly, carefully. This time, he did not stare at the sky in search of thought. He simply looked. The wind passed over him like a sigh. The stars blinked, steady in their silence. His eyes remained open for a while, not from worry, but from peace.